I don't know when we decided that by being 25, you're supposed to have a career, a relationship, a 5 year plan, financial stability, glowing skin, and inner peace. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel already behind in life. Hi, everyone. It's your host, Lopez. I am back for another episode of the Mostly Figuring Out podcast. Today is our second episode, and the title of today's episode is The Pressures of Having It All Figured Out. Mainly, this speaks to anyone, honestly, in their 20s who's just navigating comparison, identity, and uncertainty. And the pressure of, quote unquote, having it all together in your 20s is largely constructed. That can look like a lot of different things for people, whether that's their career, their relationships, or just where they want to be at in life in general. And what I'm trying to uncover today is maybe that the point of this age group or this decade of our life isn't about certainty, but it's about exploration. To start, I want to share a little bit about myself. Right now, I just turned 23 not too long ago. My current stage in life, I kind of would describe as different areas in life, I'd say. I'm currently a college student. I recently just got married. I am still living at home with my parents. So that's a tricky concept to kind of explain sometimes. Um, but this is my podcast and this is where I'm going to explain things. So, to share a little bit more about that, right now, as a college student, and even as somebody who just recently got married, some might think of those things as like great accomplishments and seeing that I have it all figured out. But that could be farther from the truth. There are definitely moments where I feel behind in life or where I feel like I don't have it all together. Um, just more specifically, my husband is in the military, which is why I live at home right now with my parents while I'm awaiting to go live with him. What will technically be overseas, so the process kind of takes a while. Um, but a lot of my friends who are married or who do live with their significant others, for example, it makes me feel left behind, which is kind of tricky to navigate in marriage. At first, before I was married, I kind of felt left behind in the sense that all of my friends were married and they were doing all of these things together and I wasn't. And so I thought that that feeling would go away once I'm married. But the comparison between even just my friends, but also on social media and in just culture in general, really was hard for me comparing my marriage to their marriages. For example, right now, at the beginning stage of my marriage, I'm not able to be with my husband. And that was something that was really hard for me to grasp at first. And it definitely did make me feel, quote unquote, like behind in my marriage journey. I'm seeing all of my friends move in together and build their apartment or houses together and do all of these things together. And I still felt behind, um, which is kind of crazy to think about because no relationship looks the same. But I think the social construct or the ideas that we have of marriage, where you get married, you move in together, you have kids, etc. I feel like I wasn't fitting that timeline. Um, so, yeah, that's just one example of where I've been feeling kind of behind lately. Now, no one directly tells you you're behind, but somehow you kind of just feel it in life. And it's subtle. It looks like scrolling and comparing your life to other people's lives or expectations that were made for you that you have yet to fulfill. Um, and just my example is, about my story with my marriage journey right now and where I'm at. But for other people, it can look like different things. For example, even as a college student, I can relate to feeling behind. I don't fit the 4 year plan that is expected of every college student who goes in their freshman year, graduates exactly 4 years after, or, excels in a program and just has all of these things figured out. It's not that simple sometimes. So whether you're married or you're a college student or you're at your job or you're starting a family or, you're not in school and you're just, working for the time being, or even in your relationships, I believe that there's always these, whether they're social constructs or just these timelines that we create for ourselves in our own head, can be really riveting to live up to, or to have those expectations for ourselves, which causes us, to feel left behind or to compare our lives to other people. And that's really hard to kind of grasp, especially in your 20s, when you're trying to figure everything out. But one question that I often ask myself, and I would encourage you guys to also think about, is who created this timeline? The timeline that we give ourselves in our current life stage, or the timeline or time frame that we feel is expected from us, and why are we so afraid of not meeting it? With that question in mind, this breaks down my first section of what I want to discuss in this podcast, which is where the pressure comes from. I want to go over some things that can kind of pertain to where the pressure comes from. In our society, social media is a big part of our lives. We see these time frames exemplified for us over Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. There's a wide plethora of influence for us to see, especially in our generation. Again, social media is our lives. We are always on it. It's kind of become a reality for us, for a lot of us, actually. We sometimes have a hard time differentiating real world experiences and real world relationships versus what we actually see online. So, with that, sometimes when we see things on social media, we feel left behind, or we feel, how would I describe that? We compare ourselves to what we see online, of course, and it it puts us in this mind frame of like, why don't I have what they have? With that in general, that creates us a harsh timeline of what is expected of us and in our lives. So I think sometimes we forget that social media is a creation. It's a way for us to express ourselves and to share certain things about our lives, but it's also a curated version of those things. In the past, it didn't used to be that way, but now you have people who can create personas, create stories, create this personal branding of who they are and what their life looks like with no evidence to back it up for the most part. I could go online right now and post a curated timeline of pictures that create this story that I have everything figured out. I have a picture posted at my job, I have a picture posted with my family, my husband, activities that I like to do. And when people see those stories or those personas that we create, it influences other people. And that influence can be, yes, helpful, which is why we have influencers who we either look up to or, of course, take influence from. But, sometimes that's not the real, authentic version of that person. It's probably that persona that they've built up over time. And so sometimes it's tricky to kind of navigate what I'm ingesting in my mind or what I'm taking in and I'm seeing, and allowing that to dictate or influence my life and my timeline. For example, all of my friends around me, when they graduated, they posted all of these pictures throughout maybe their college time or even just in graduation, really. And that was hard for me to kind of look on social media and be like, wow, like they had a great college experience. They went out, they partied, they did all of these things in such a short amount of time. Like, why can't I do that? And then I go on campus and I talk to real people and I hear all these different types of stories from different types of people, and you have certain people who are, maybe freshly 17, 18 years old, and they just hopped into college because they did a really great Excel program in their high school, and now they're here and they have all of these accomplishments. And then right next to you sitting is somebody who's maybe in their 50s or 60s, and they didn't get the opportunity to go to college when they were younger, and this is their time now. And that is one example where I often revert that feeling of left behind, quote unquote. It just pushes me into reality that when I talk to people in person instead of online, those curated stories or expectations aren't always the case. Especially in a place like a college campus where there's so many people and you have so many different stories, it's hard to kind of fit a specific timeline in so many different people's lives. And with that, it brings into the subject of productivity culture. Especially here in America, we are very fast paced. I've often heard the symbolism or the quote of the rat race that we face in our culture today. So, given that, there's this expected timeline for us to always be going on to the next thing or moving on to the next chapter in life. And sometimes it just doesn't look that simple. But that is where the pressure comes from. Whether it's our productivity culture or our social media, or even just we see our peers in person moving at different speeds, that can be sometimes hard to grasp. And that pressure of everybody around you is moving at a certain pace and you maybe aren't. And that's something that's also a form of pressure, and it can get us stuck in our minds and having us feel left behind, especially if it's in person or it's somebody close to you, your family, your friends, your coworkers. That puts a lot of pressure on you in real life, which is just hard to kind of grasp sometimes. So thinking about those external pressures and where they come from, I also want to dive into my next section, which is the internal pressure that we place on ourselves. Now I kind of want to create this inward shift. Sometimes the pressure isn't even external, it's just me. It's this voice inside my head that says, you should be further by now. You should look like they look like, or you should have what they have. Your life should look like their lives right now. And those are all very real thoughts that I'm sure a lot of us experience in life when we're inwardly reflecting on what our life looks like or where we should be at in this stage of life. Now, thinking about those inward thoughts or those inward pressures, internal pressures per se, it can get a little vulnerable to think about those things and think about where those thoughts come from and why do I have these thoughts, which for some people can be really hard to think about or even really tricky to kind of identify. Some of those concepts look like perfectionism or fear of disappointing your parents, the fear of disappointing your friends, embarrassment. You have that feeling of wanting to prove something either to others or even to yourself, or that you have an identity attached to achievement. And that's just an example of certain concepts or thoughts that we might have, or identifying the thoughts that we do have. And for everybody, that can look different. Whether you're reflecting about, your relationships in life, or you're reflecting about your job or your student career, all of those concepts can shift to whatever aspect of life you're in or the stage of life that you're in. But I think identifying those internal pressures and where they come from is a big, step in figuring out what makes me feel the way that I do, or what makes me want to achieve this internal time frame that I set for myself. To start, I want to kind of explain, some of the things that I've analyzed in myself. I earlier shared about my experience in my marriage journey and how I've kind of set up a certain time frame for myself where I compare myself to other people. But there's also other aspects of my life where I just feel behind, which of course is the concept of this podcast. I'm in my 20s. I'm constantly feeling behind in every stage of my life. But I kind of want to break down, certain aspects of my life or certain stages and, kind of internalize, like, why do I have this pressure inside of me? Where does it come from? What do those things kind of look like? Because I know I'm not alone. I've talked to many friends and peers, and they've kind of shared, similar identifications in their thoughts and thought processes. And so I think it's important to, one, yes, share those things, but also kind of share how to start thinking about those internal thoughts and internal pressures. Again, I'm going to use my marriage journey as an example, just because it's the most recent thing that's going on in my life. So I feel a little bit more educated on why I felt those things that I felt and how I got there. For me, my whole life, I've always been very self-reflective. I internally think a lot of thoughts, and I'm always thinking about, why am I doing this? Who am I doing this for? Etc. I understand that that can be hard for other people. So it's kind of hard and tricky to kind of figure out where those thoughts are coming from and how to even have those thoughts. Sometimes it's hard for people to be vulnerable with themselves and think about those certain things. Again, since it's not so tricky for me, it's something that I feel like I'm very good at. I like to self-reflect and internally reflect. But it's still sometimes hard to figure out things about ourselves or admit things about ourselves, especially in my beginning stages of my marriage. Like I said, my husband is in the military. And that definitely, of course, was a huge factor of us getting married. I will say it wasn't the factor of getting married. We talked about this long before him joining the military. But it was a big factor that played into some of these internal thoughts that I was having, or these internal pressures that I was having in thinking about being married or sharing my story or my experience in marriage. When you're young, I consider myself young. I'm 23. And everybody that I've talked to will definitely say that, yes, I am married young. With that, there's so many pressures just on being married alone, but also being married young. And there's all of these expectations and criticisms and connotations of being married young, but also being married young in the military. There's this connotation that, people only get married in the military for the benefits, and getting married in the military young is just wrong because it's going to fail, and once, those benefits are gone, the marriage is ended, and etc. That is something that I faced when my husband first told me he wanted to join the military. I come from a military background, so those expectations and ideas weren't new to me. I knew what I was getting myself into with certain time frames or expectations that were going to be held for me as a young military wife. I wouldn't express that being a military wife is a huge part of my identity to other people, which is also hard for me, and I'm still working through that expectation and that internal pressure of being this perfect young military wife and whatnot. That's something I'm still working through. But to keep the story going, I felt that in getting married, and I had to have everything together. Growing up, I didn't have the best exemplification of marriage. And so growing up, I knew I wanted to have certain things accomplished when I got married, or what I wanted my early stages of marriage to look like, or, planning my wedding, or what I wanted my husband to be like. And while I think it is very healthy to set boundaries and expectations on certain things, especially big things like marriage, I sometimes remember that life just always doesn't look like that. I didn't expect to be married this young. I always wished for it, but I never expected it. And my marriage and our wedding kind of happened very quickly, just because, the way things work out in life. And that was a huge hitter for me specifically. I had always envisioned myself, being married and having this long engagement and taking the time to plan my wedding and my dress and my bridesmaids, my venue, my colors, etc. I had this time frame in my head that I wanted it to be, spaced out very well, and I wanted to do this at this time, and I wanted to have this and this. And me personally, I have recognized that sometimes I struggle with self-control. And that was a huge hitter for me when feeling this pressure of I have to get everything done at this time and it has to get done this way, if that makes sense. But in that, long story short, my marriage and my wedding planning, etc., didn't go the way that I expected it to go. Not that it was bad. I love my experience personally. But the internal pressures that I put on myself were really being challenged. I struggle with perfectionism, like I said. I struggle with disappointing my parents. I struggle with how my marriage will look on the outside. Um, I didn't want it to look like I'm just this girl who's marrying a guy because he's in the military and I want the benefits. Or I was even scared of how it made my husband look. Like, oh, he's only marrying me because he wants the benefits or he wants to do X, Y, Z, which is really hard. And it's really vulnerable to kind of admit that. I don't think I've, processed that with many people besides this podcast. But it is a very real idea of these internal pressures that we place on ourselves. And that was really hard for me to experience and think about while being in this stage. I feel like sometimes those internal pressures kind of robbed me of experiencing, a real world experience. Yeah, like marriage. Like I feel like sometimes those internal pressures kind of withheld certain feelings or certain experiences or certain emotions that I was supposed to feel in marriage just because, I was scared of being perfect, or I was scared of disappointing my parents, or I was scared of looking a certain way to other people. And that was all pressures that I placed within myself, you know? Which I won't say that those aren't real fears or those aren't real outcomes for people. I definitely have seen like some parents be disappointed in their children for whether it's marrying the wrong person or going to the wrong college or doing the wrong thing, etc. Which is, I think, why I have those fears placed internally, based off of things that happened in my life prior. I've messed up a bunch of times, which is why I probably feel like this internal need to be perfect all of the time or to have everything in control because my life in the past has been so chaotic that I want inner peace. I'm always looking for this inner peace. So I want everything to be perfect. Or I have this fear of disappointing my parents because I don't like disappointing my parents. Or wanting something to prove. Again, going back to just me specifically, I feel like that you always have to like prove something to somebody, especially if you're married young. Because everyone just has this connotation that like being married young is just wrong and it's this like terrible connotation. So I feel like I had something to prove in, going through my marriage journey. And those are all internal thoughts. Like, yes, they're real outcomes, but I think sometimes I just put so much pressure on myself internally that it robbed me of certain things, which is a very real concept, like sometimes even as a college student, I put so much pressure on myself to get the right class and to do very well and all of these things. And it did, of course, help miss, like it robbed me of certain college experiences. I didn't prioritize, social interaction as much. I didn't prioritize joining a club or getting involved or marketing and networking. And those are all very important things that I think college teaches you that nobody really talks about very often. It's mainly the big focus of you go, get good grades, and you get out in 4 years. Um, and so, yeah, I think those are just some internal pressures, and just sharing my story of how those internal pressures kind of created this certain outcome for me. And that may, again, look different for everybody. Sometimes the pressure isn't even just external, again, it's those voices in your head that are pushing you to have a certain time frame or a certain timeline or to look a certain way. And when that doesn't happen sometimes, just because life is unpredictable, it does put you in that space to feel left behind. So after analyzing the external pressures and the internal pressures of, these time frames and expectations of, analyzing like why we feel left behind and where those things come from, I hope I've made sense so far. But I also, for my last, section of the podcast, I want to provide, a resolution or kind of like the main lesson of why we're talking about this. And for me, I've been expressive about why I've gotten to where I've gotten and, analyzing external and internal pressures. But I also want to express, the things that I have learned to help combat those pressures, whether it's externally, like social media timeline, or our in-person peers or experiences, or those internal pressures, like those thoughts, those experiences that we've had in the past. I want to share how unlearning those certain things, pivoting from those patterns or real world experiences, have shaped what I've learned and how to resolve those conflicts. Again, I want to express I'm still in my early 20s and I'm still learning how to self-analyze and portray my identity and just live life without just breezing by and having this no care attitude, but also setting up healthy expectations and living up to those things, etc. But again, what I've learned throughout that are, some of the things that I've expressed in, the previous segments, but also what I'm unlearning, which is, I think, a hard thing for people to concept or even grasp in this stage of life where we feel like we're supposed to be learning everything or we're supposed to be having everything figured out. And so sometimes it's hard to understand or even think about having to unlearn certain things, which I think is a good identification that you're always learning and you're always doing things. You're learning and unlearning and you're figuring it out. Yeah, which is, of course, the whole point of this podcast. But I think sometimes we generalize our 20s. And we think about it as this time where we're learning and we're grasping all this new information and how am I going to set up my life? And that's what we're supposed to identify in our 20s. And sometimes we have this idea that we're just supposed to be taking in and setting up. But sometimes that looks like unlearning stuff, especially unlearning expectations or unlearning why I do certain things or how to do certain things internally and externally. For me, what I've unlearned how to do is I've unlearned how to let those internal thoughts be a dictator of my actions. Certain things like self-awareness or even just showing up and trying, being honest with myself or with others about how I'm feeling, or just staying curious and having an open mind of what life looks like. I shared earlier that one of the things I struggle with is having control and wanting things to go my way and etc. One thing that I'm having to unlearn is giving myself grace to live and to figure things out and to recognize that life just isn't always going to go my way. And my expectations are good to have, but they are not indicators of success or well-being all the time. that my worth does not come from the internal expectations that I've placed for myself, or even the external ones that I may be comparing myself to, but my worth comes from my authenticity and my experience, and I get to choose how worthy I feel in those experiences. I've come to find that I can redefine what it looks like to have it all together. That the expectations that I've seen in my life or I've placed internally with certain thoughts doesn't have to look like what I think it's supposed to look like. Or certain people don't have to act the way I think they should act because we're humans. And I think that's a very hard concept, especially for me to grasp. But sometimes when we want something so badly to work out, or we want something so badly in our life to be portrayed, when it doesn't go that way, we can hit a really hard crash. And with that, what I've learned for myself and what I think is a good idea to kind of grasp about having it all together is that sometimes having it together doesn't mean about having all the answers or having a perfect outcome or exceeding your expectations perfectly or similarly, but it just means that you're brave enough to keep asking questions and to keep going and to keep striving for your worthiness in your life, or what brings you joy, or what brings you satisfaction or contentment. I think that having it all together is a social construct that kind of places us in this box where our lives are supposed to look like ABC or XYZ. But I think that just having it together just means like you show up every day and you keep striving to your goals or to your expectations, or just having something in mind or something that you want to happen. Just keep striving at it. And the journey, how it looks, doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, I did this and I did it the perfect way, but sometimes it's about like, hey, I got here and I showed up and I did my best. Didn't look like how I expected it to look, or didn't look like how somebody told me it was supposed to look, but I did it and I accomplished it. And I think having it together again just means, you're going after something, and you're going after it with integrity and persistence and consistency and just the joy of seeking that out. I feel like I'm reiterating myself a little bit, so I'll end on that note. But some advice that I would have to somebody who's in a similar situation of feeling this pressure of, needing to have it all figured out, or, just stuck because they don't have it all figured out. I would suggest to give yourself some grace, to maybe take yourself outside of yourself, which can kind of seem hard to do sometimes. But look at your life outside of what's going on in your own head and reflect and practice gratitude. Something practical that I think helps is always being grateful. Something that I've not been perfect at, but I try to implement occasionally, when I feel down or when I feel like something's not going the right way, is I take some time at the end of the day and I either think about or write down 3 things that I've been grateful for that day. And it allows me to kind of shift my perspective on where I'm at in life or what I'm going through. And gratitude, I think, is a way to give yourself some grace and to not put so much pressure on yourself. And with that gratitude, also just allowing yourself to just be. I think realizing sometimes that you're a human and you can just be, and you don't have to always live up to certain expectations. And yeah, just giving yourself that grace, I think, is my main advice. Give yourself some grace. Learn to have fun in the journey that you're doing. Don't do it just because you want to impress somebody or you want to satisfy that internal thought, but find the real reason of why you're doing what you're doing and go for it and have fun doing it. I think sometimes the pressure, again, takes so much joy out of what we're experiencing in life. And I've lived it. Of course, I've shared in this podcast, but I would encourage whoever's listening to just be kind to yourself. Have fun doing the things that you're doing. Don't do it for other people or for any other reason than for yourself. I think in this scenario, I think you have one life and you should do the things that you would like to do. Take that with a grain of salt. I wouldn't encourage anyone to just, willy-nilly go do whatever they want to do. It's not so much of a big deal at the end of the day. And lastly, I think there's one thing I'm walking away with after this discussion, and maybe you are too, hopefully, and it's that the pressure to have it all together is mostly just noise. It's comparison, it's timelines, it's expectations that we didn't even, consciously agree to. The truth is that nobody really has it all figured out. Some people just package it better than others. Your 20s aren't a performance. They're not a checklist, they're not a race. They're a season of becoming, of trying things and of changing your mind and of growing into somebody you haven't even met yet. So if you've been feeling behind lately, this is your reminder. You are not behind. You're building. And building takes time. We are all in our own way, just mostly figuring it out. With that includes this week's episode of the Mostly Figuring It Out podcast. I want to thank you guys for sitting and listening and just interacting with me as I share upon this topic. I hope that this encourages somebody somehow to think about their feelings of feeling behind in life. I hope to see you guys on the next episode. Thank you.